Thank you, everyone, for joining today, and welcome to today's event, our international virtual event on nature-based solutions as a catalyst for achieving mutual benefits for people, nature, and climate. Lessons learned from China and around the world. I'm very pleased to be moderating today's event. My name is Richard Florzone. I am CEO and President of the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Canada. Now, today's event has been organized jointly by the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development, or as we often refer to it as CICED, so you'll hear that acronym a little bit through the session, and the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD. CICID serves as a high-level advisory body with a mandate to conduct research and to provide policy recommendations to the government of China on China's environment and development. And IISD is a Canadian-based international policy think tank working to accelerate solutions for a stable climate, sustainable resources, and fair economies. Our event today is bilingual. You are able to follow the event in English or Chinese, and on the bottom of your screen, you should see a language button. Look for the globe logo that enables you to choose Chinese or English if you require translation. Today's event will feature expert inputs and discussions on assessing the impact and results of nature-based solutions. It's a topic that we are all hearing increasingly more about in recent months as countries around the world look to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. We'll be hearing about the added value and policy relevance of nature-based solutions. Panelists will share their experience on the application of nature-based solutions, or NBS, as we sometimes refer to them, to provide long-term social, ecological, and economic benefits. You'll hear about lessons learned from the resulting evidence base and how NBS can support policy implementation. We'll have two exciting panel discussions, so we're sort of broken into two parts with a range of speakers. Each session will include short inputs followed by panel discussion and hopefully time for questions from the audience. You can submit your questions to the speakers in the Q&A box you see on your screen. And a final note, this event is being recorded and will be made available online on IISD's website later this week. So that's some of the preamble. Let's get started. We're pleased to have Canada's Ambassador for Climate Change, Patricia Fuller, and CCICED's International Chief Advisor to the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development, or CCICED, Scott Vaughan, to provide opening remarks. So with that, I'd like to introduce Patricia Fuller, my friend and Canada's Ambassador for Climate Change. Patricia was named Canada's ambassador on June 5th, 2018 for a term of 3 years, and her mandate includes providing advice on climate change considerations in Canada's international priorities. It includes leading bilateral engagements with partner countries on clean growth and climate change. She represents Canada in international cooperative initiatives related to climate change, and she promotes Canada's clean growth and climate change priorities. Ambassador Fuller represents Canada on behalf of Canada's Environment and Climate Change Minister in the Global Commission on Adaptation and is co-leading the Commission's nature-based solution action track with Mexico. So very well equipped to speak here today. Ambassador Fuller, over to you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's a real pleasure to participate in this symposium that CICID and IISD have come together to organize. And I'm very pleased that nature-based solutions are a priority area for the China Council. Certainly, the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss are closely intertwined, and we cannot solve one without solving the other. And protecting and conserving nature is central to combating climate change, both for mitigation as well as for adaptation to climate change. And as many of you will know, studies have suggested that 30% of the Paris Agreement goals, the temperature goals, could be met through nature-based solutions. And then in addition to that, there are the significant benefits for adaptation. And that is because protecting and restoring nature builds resilience to the impacts of climate change in many different ways, from absorption of floodwaters and coastal storm surges to the cooling effects of urban tree canopies, just to name some examples. So these climate benefits, together with the benefits for biodiversity, are why the government of Canada has recently committed to investing almost $4 billion in nature-based climate solutions, including the planting of 2 billion trees. And the challenge globally is to increase the scale and speed at which the world is adopting nature-based solutions. And so this is an important conversation today. Overcoming this challenge means demonstrating the economic and societal value of these solutions to encourage greater investments in nature. And that's why Canada has been co-leading with Mexico the nature-based solutions action track for the Global Commission on Adaptation, which will culminate in the Adaptation Summit this coming Monday. Through our work on nature-based solutions through the action track, we've generated valuable insights from leading countries, including the Netherlands, Peru, Ethiopia, Canada, Mexico, as well as cities around the world and communities around the world. We've had a series of virtual events where we engaged a wide-ranging audience of some 2,000 people around the world. And we heard clearly that Indigenous people have a key role to play in the implementation of nature-based solutions. These solutions must advance and not diminish Indigenous rights. And Canada has shared our example of Indigenous protected and conserved areas, which are multiplying rapidly in Canada. The action track also uncovered innovative financing models that have the potential to increase financing for nature-based solutions. And in order to achieve scale for these promising financing models, we have to spread awareness of them. And we also need to strengthen how we measure and report the value of nature-based solutions, which I know the China Council and IISD are looking at through your research and through events like today's. Of course, public sector investments have an important role to play in financing the uptake of nature-based solutions, but we have to continue to build the business case in order to promote and mobilize private sector investment in nature-based solutions. And in that connection, Mark Carney's work for COP26 as special envoy, the work he's doing on voluntary carbon markets has the potential to increase the flow of private sector funds to nature-based projects from the current estimates of only around 300 million per year to where they should be, more than 100 billion per year. And this effort will be spurred on by increasing climate-based risk financial disclosure. Carbon market projects can and also must be designed to maximize adaptation and biodiversity benefits. So to learn more about how we can catalyze greater action, I do encourage you to join us on Monday, January 25th for the Climate Adaptation Summit, where Canada and Mexico will host an event for the Nature-Based Solutions Action Track, presenting the insights generated through our work, which we have carried out in close collaboration with key partners, including UNEP, the Global Environmental Fund, WRI, the Global Center for Adaptation, and other partners. So my thanks to all of them. I will send it back to you, Richard. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate today.
Thank you, Ambassador Fuller. Just to amplify 2 points. First off, isn't it impressive? You heard Ambassador Fuller talk about the amazing benefits of nature-based solutions. 30% of Paris targets, as well as benefits for adaptation and biodiversity. I think that summarizes very well the interest here. And as well on the Climate Adaptation Summit, we can put it into the chat if you like. That's hosted by the government of the Netherlands, and the website is CAS 2021, CAS 2021.com. So have a look for that. Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Fuller. I'm now, it's really my pleasure to introduce my friend Scott Vaughan, the International Chief Advisor to CICID. Scott, until early 2019, he was actually my predecessor. He was President and CEO of IISD, and prior to that, Scott served in some very senior roles related to the environment and sustainable development. He was Canada's Federal Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development and Director of the Department of Sustainable Development at the OAS, the Organization of American States. He was the head of economics and trade for the NAFTA Environment Commission and counselor at the WTO. Scott, thank you for joining us today, and over to you.
Richard, thanks very much, and thanks very much to you and your wonderful IISD colleagues, Ann Hamill and others for organizing, and also just to say congratulations and sincere thanks to Ambassador Fuller for really Canada's exceptional leadership, not only on the climate file, but also on the biodiversity file. Canada was one of the signatories to the Pledge for Nature. And so Ambassador, very nice to see you, and thanks so much. I just very, very quickly wanted to just give you a sense of where some of the work of the China Council is on nature-based solutions. And I'll just briefly give you a couple of sort of founding contextual markers. And the first one is just how strong the engagement and progress is domestically within China on biodiversity conservation. There's a really strong normative, sort of philosophical framework of this around China's vision of what's called an ecological civilization. Also green development, which is very prominent in the current 14th five-year plan, which will be released next month. But also really innovative implementation of biodiversity conservation, particularly a large-scale spatial planning or large landscape approach to biological conservation called the ecological red line. So today, China's terrestrial biodiversity, now 25%, is under formal protection. And what's also very interesting is that with its ecological red line, in addition to conservation and biodiversity, it's now including carbon and looking at the potential convergence between areas of high ecosystem importance and also areas of high carbon sequestration importance. So that and lots of other things with the biodiversity side, but also from the climate side, China now joins 60 other countries, including Canada, the European Union, and others, moving towards carbon neutrality. And that push towards carbon neutrality is now unleashing, even since the announcement in September, an extraordinary amount of work around a range of issues, economic sectors and policies. China's enabling regulation for its emissions trading system at the national level were formalized 2 weeks ago, and its national market will come online in February. That will be the largest carbon market in the world, and many other initiatives. So within that, the importance and opportunity of nature-based solutions is extremely high particularly for the reasons that the ambassador laid out. The science of nature-based solutions is very high. The IPCC calls it an indispensable part of looking at both climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And there's been very valuable work, including from the Chinese academies, where they've looked and identified some of the leading areas of nature-based solutions approaches. First, as in many countries, led by forestry and afforestation. Also looking at agriculture, low tillage, grazing in forest areas, and avoiding of peatlands as among those areas. But even with that, this still is, from Chinese colleagues, still a relatively new area, despite 10, 15 years of work on different parts of this, including REDD+ for those of you that follow this work. But many challenges. I mean, one is the lack of a clear governance system to coordinate nature-based solutions at very much at the community level. How to measure it, something I'll come back to, something the ambassador highlighted. And also looking at what do these projects mean at an aggregate level. So within that, the China Council has launched work on nature-based solutions in the fall of 2020. Very strong engagement from Chinese colleagues, the lead negotiator of Ministry of Ecology and Environment, Chinese national academies and different research institutes, and then how China Council works, strong engagement from the international side. And so on the work, Thomas Lovejoy, Canada's Harvey Locke from the Banff Centre, Art Hansen, and also some of the leaders on in this area: Nature Conservancy, the World Economic Forum, Green Climate Fund, GEF, World Resources Institute, WWF, UNEP, UNDP, WBCSD, OECD, and others. And we'll be moving on this work in the next for probably 3 months. I just wanted to mention in closing 3 of the topics that we're actually looking at in the context of this. And the first one is safeguards. We know that the science of nature-based solutions is clear, but also the importance, again, as the ambassador mentioned, of making sure in looking at places, we begin by looking at the benefits of people, of community engagement, of Indigenous peoples' engagement, and making sure they're designed in a way which build real livelihoods. And so we've been, like many, looking at the IUCN global standards for nature-based solutions, the criteria within that. One of the challenges that we'll be looking at, in addition to the people-centered approaches, is looking at how to move beyond do no harm to look at net positive outcomes from NBS. The second is scale, and there are now literally thousands of examples of NBS on different really useful portals. The big question when you look at this is that most of these, the vast majority of these, are highly localized at the local level: green roofs, vertical walls in cities, urban drainage, coastal mangroves and wetlands that cover 10 to 15 kilometers. But this question of scalability is really hard. And what are then some of the measures in order to get that right? And then the third one the ambassador mentioned is measurement, and that's what I'll close with. The Chinese colleagues, like many, particularly as they start thinking about reviewing their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement in 2021, this question of measurement. So how do you think about nature-based solutions from a cost-benefit analysis in relation to more traditional engineering, great infrastructure, or other approaches to mitigation and adaptation? And I think this is a really hard issue. The delighted colleagues from the Global Environment Facility are on this call. They released a really useful paper in December 2020, looking exactly at this question of measurability. One area that we'll be looking at in thinking about this is not only how does gray compare to green in terms of benefits, but also how to think about nature-based solutions from a wider natural capital perspective. So the report will be ready in draft form in the next couple of weeks, and then be ready for a public release probably by the summer of 2021. So with that, I'll very much looking forward to this discussion, and thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Scott. It's great to hear about China's commitment to nature-based solutions, its interlinkages with things like biodiversity and important industries like agriculture, which is, of course, so important in Canada. We'll be hearing more from CICED members throughout the session and some wrap-up from Scott at the end. And you also heard from Scott. I mean, you're getting a great introduction here because you heard some of the benefits from Ambassador Fuller, and Scott spoke to a number of the considerations in implementing NBS. You heard about governance, Indigenous engagement, scale, and measurement, all important topics that we're going to get into. To step back and give us an introduction now to nature-based solutions, overall, I'm just really pleased to introduce Alok Barnwell, who is a senior climate change specialist with the Global Environmental Facility, GEF. And that's just fantastic because for those of you that don't know, the GEF, they've provided $20 billion in financing for various environmental projects in over 170 countries over the last 30 years. So they know a lot about this topic. Alok works as a senior climate change specialist at GEF. He manages climate change adaptation projects, particularly in the least developed countries. And in that role, he's leading various country-based and global projects that aim to accelerate uptake of nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation. He also coordinates the Jeff's Sustainable Cities program and leads Jeff's engagement with cities and partner organizations, including MDBs, UN agencies, CSOs, and city networks. Alok, over to you for introduction. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this very timely and important event on nature-based solutions. And it's a great dialogue, and the panel looks great with policy leaders like Ambassador Fuller, financial institutions, practitioners, and think tanks and private sector. So amazing composition, and I'll really look forward to gaining more from this event over the period of next 2 hours. As Richard, you introduced also Jeff really well, and I'm also pleased to tell that Jeff has close ties with CCICED. Our former CEO, Naoko, was one of the advisors, and I had the opportunity to support her on providing inputs on CCICED's policy recommendation for China's 14th five-year plan last year. And I recall very clearly that our inputs included nature-based solutions. And it's great to see that nature-based solutions is being discussed in such a great detail today. So it's a great journey, a great engagement. Our new CEO is one of the champions, global champions of nature-based solutions. So I'm sure that our partnership will strengthen further going forward. Yeah, so I think Scott and Ambassador Fuller set the context really well on the benefits. We commissioned a study to our scientific and technical advisory panel last year to review our portfolio further on nature-based solutions and understand the science and the evolution. And the study revealed that the ecosystem-based approach is rooted at the ecosystem-based approach of Convention on Biodiversity. And the term was first used in a World Bank report in 2008 on climate and biodiversity. It was just lightly used, not detailed out greatly in the report. But then since then, it became really core to CBD, IPBES reports, and also in Jeff programming. And then ultimately becoming one of the key strategies of IUCN and leading to global nature-based solution standards, which was released last year. Nature-based solutions integration within climate really got the momentum in UN Climate Action Summit, where it was discussed both as adaptation and mitigation solution to achieve large-scale benefits, particularly meeting the Paris climate goals. And over the last couple of years, the Global Commission on Adaptation has been championing, and I would like to thank again Ambassador Fuller for her leadership on this, and the Commission is not just linking nature-based solution with adaptation benefits, but also has identified it as one of the key solutions for global resilient recovery post-COVID-19. Next slide, please. So over the period, NBS has evolved more as an integrated and proactive approach. So a lot of evidence is coming, a lot of papers, a lot of think tanks working on it, a lot of investments which are supporting NBS are delivering results. And what we have now is that NBS is more of a holistic approach going beyond biodiversity to mitigation, resilience, adaptation, and socioeconomic benefits as well. It has also become a proactive approach, going beyond just protection, restoration, and management to construction. For example, using nature-based infrastructure for climate and development benefits. For example, constructed wetlands or green spaces in cities, or many other constructed nature-based infrastructure solutions. It's also a systemic solution. It is one of the central solution on system-based programming, which looks at tackling human and natural system conflicts. And the evidence is strong that this health pandemic is rooted at the degradation of nature, and therefore it's really important that nature-based solution is part of overall system transformation that we look at to make ourselves resilient to future pandemics. It is also a comprehensive approach. I think Scott alluded to it, that how this is applied at local level and also at global and landscape level. It can also be applied across food value chains, cities, and very local at villages for improving resilience and supporting adaptation of communities. Next slide, please. However, still there are a lot of systemic barriers for large-scale adoption, particularly for the climate and economic benefits side. One of the key barriers is that still there are many unknowns, despite that the progress is impressive. There is strong political momentum, there is strong investment commitments from different organizations, different institutions, but still the evidence matrix and indicators for measurements is still not there for practitioners. The understanding of short-term versus long-term benefits needs to be strengthened further. The monetary value, which makes it comparable with built infrastructure and makes use of land more competitive compared to other options, that is still being developed. Jeff is glad to work with IISD on this, and I'll share that project's information in a bit. And I think Andrea from IISD will be talking about it today. Equity is also one of the points, and I think Patricia raised this as well. There are institutional limitations. NBS requires more cross-sectoral and landscape approaches, given the scale. But in where it is applied, the institutions function more in sectoral silos. So that's one of the challenges which needs to be looked at. It requires capacity at all levels in government and private sector, down to the action level where the capacity gap is still there. And there is a knowledge gap, design, use of science, community awareness, and finally the finance gap, which is kind of depend on the other barriers that I spoke about. Next slide, please. The encouraging news is that there is great emerging policy and financial landscape. We heard about political leadership of Canada and Mexico linking NBS with climate adaptation. China has been leading, particularly on the city side. Spawn City is one of the pioneers. China is. UK has made NBS central to COP26 discussions, and there are many vanguard countries and cities under the Global Commission on Adaptation who will be committing for NBS in the Climate Adaptation Summit next week. There is also EU and others who are really committing to support nature-based solutions. There is also, we are seeing flow of climate funds. Last week in One Planet Summit, France and UK very explicitly committed for NBS out of their climate finance. Our Special Climate Change Fund is also supporting a study to address the barrier of understanding the monetary value of nature-based infrastructure. And NBS is quite central to our cities program, which I coordinate. And I'm glad to say that China is one of our key partners in the program. And in the GEF7 phase, the cities program will be focusing exclusively on nature-based solutions in strategic cities like Ningbo, Chengdu, and Changcheng. And many other countries are also prioritizing. Next slide, please. Private sector is stepping up. I'm sure we'll be listening more to speakers today. Knowledge is generated. We are working along with our scientific and technical advisory panel, And there is emerging global partnership between cities, alliances of private sector, the Science-Based Target Network, and of course, the Great Green Wall Initiative, which is looking at NBS in a much more holistic way. Next slide, please. And that will be, next slide. That's my final slide. There are great opportunities, and we, from Jeff perspective, we see that the momentum needs to be built. More application of science and spatial data, for example, needs to be applied in nature-based solutions planning, design, and implementation. Overall, the integrated planning governance needs to be advanced. Collaboration needs to be strengthened, and this year, both the COPs of climate and biodiversity gives us a great opportunity. Private sector engagement on innovation and technology and investment could be strengthened further. And of course, making nature-based solutions central to green and inclusive economic recovery. And I'd like to conclude by saying that we perceive NBS as a benefit multiplier, not just as an alternative, but also as complementary to gray and built infrastructure. NBS is going to be one of our central points as we start our GEF 8 replenishment strategy. And we look forward to collaboration with all the stakeholders and IISD and CCICED as we move forward. Thank you, Richard, for the opportunity to set context and sharing my views.
Thank you, Alok. Thank you for that terrific introduction. It's amazing, isn't it, as you said, that this idea of nature-based solutions, it's really only been talked about. Of course, the concept has been around forever, but you heard Alok also speak to a number of considerations, I think very consistent with what Scott's remarks were about scale, about equity. And I just want to highlight a couple of gaps that Alok mentioned as well, was around knowledge and financing. And I think that's really good because we'll start to get into that. The nature-based solutions can have a very, very significant work together on these kinds of solutions, how best to analyze them, and that'll help close the financing gap. So a terrific introduction. So let's now turn to session 1, which is all about what nature-based solutions can do for us. And so this session highlights the potential value of nature-based solutions and how they can and have been, in fact, contributing to national policy commitments and implementation. So it will further explore the evidence and the results of investments made so far. So we'll start to close that knowledge that knowledge gap on NBS right here. I'm going to introduce our 3 panelists all at once, and then they will each speak for 6 to 7 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. Our 3 panelists are Mr. Wang Yi, Vice President, Institute of Science and Development, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and co-team lead of CCICED, Special Policy Studies on Global Climate Governance and China's Role. Professor Wang is actively engaged in many aspects of China's policy studies. His research results have contributed to form and shape many of China's current policymaking and institutional arrangements in the field of sustainable development, especially in the fields of climate change and, of course, comprehensive planning for environmental development. Mr. Wang will be speaking about leading Chinese practices at the policy and project level to advance the implementation of nature-based solutions in China and beyond. We then also have Ms. Sophie van de Hoestenay, who is a project advisor with the European Commission. Ms. van de Hoestenay is a project advisor in the field of biodiversity and ecosystems at the European Commission since 2012, where she led the expert group on nature-based solutions. So a great background for today's discussion. Prior to Ms. van de Hoestenay's role with the EU, she was a postdoctoral researcher in the field of ecology. And she'll be speaking about how nature-based solutions are supporting policy implementation in the EU, with a particular focus on the Horizon 2020 program. And then we have Ms. Akanksha Khatri, head of the Nature Action Agenda at the World Economic Forum. Ms. Khatri is head of Nature Action Agenda for the WEF's Platform for Global Public Goods. Prior to that, she was a lead on government engagement for India and South Asia for WEF's regional and government engagement. And she'll be speaking about the WEF's new report and why the loss in nature and services that we derive from it are a risk to businesses. And again, that'll help us with thinking about this financing gap. So with that, I will please turn it over to Mr. Wang. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Richard. And also thank you, Sam's invitation for me to share my points with you on the MBS for the biodiversity. I'm sorry, I would like to speak in Chinese. 大家好，非常高兴参加这个会。然后，我想可能今天上午我们在全国人大的常委会正在讨论，第一次讨论关于湿地保护法的这个制定啊，所以这也是跟那个 NBS 有关系。我想跟大家分享的第一个观点是说，其实我们第一是如何去探讨在一个新的环境下去讨论特别是在这个后工业化社会来讨论 NBS 的问题，因为NBS 实际上并不是一个全新的概念，那么在中国传统社会里头也都用到这个概念，在这个水利方面。
It's not a so-called brand new approach per se. In fact, in agriculture, in urban development, a lot of the NBS approaches have been used in China already. But right now we're living in a new environment per se, because the data accessibility is more, and then general public is more willing to pay for the compensation, services. And that's why we think the timing right now is particularly good. NPS right now is particularly well aligned with the Chinese environment when we also have the Eco Red Line program. And right now, China's overall principles are the so-called energy saving as well as the ecosystem oriented. So we do want to preserve nature, and so that's the overall context inside China. And I would like to talk about the work China has done in 5 areas, or will do in 5 areas. First, it's related to land, and that means we need to give more space to NPS. And we, in fact, have attached great importance to the protection of land at the national level, and we also pay attention to the so-called carrying capacity of the ecosystem, and the eco compensation approach has already been used. We, in fact, want to, introduce the so-called natural capital as a concept and put a value on the natural capital, on the natural resources. And so we want to adopt a very macro approach, which is somewhat different than NBS per se. And secondly, we want to develop a circular economy. And for some commodities, how can we circulate them and recycle them? And in fact, the NBS can play a role. And in this regard, China has passed, for example, some laws to support and promote the circular economy. And recently, China has advocated the sorting out of garbage, and has restricted the use of plastic products, restricted the imports of some particular plastic garbage, etc. And then the third part, in fact, is more about the soft commodities. And China wants to set up a more sustainable trade as well as supply chain around the world. And in fact, in 2020, there was another study that I participated in, and that is about the establishment of a grain supply chain. We want to build up a supply chain of timber, soybeans, and palm oil, as well as beef. So such soft commodities supply chain we want to help to build in China. And of course, another issue is information disclosure and the standard setting, and the cost of registration for such standards. We need some institutional arrangements to be made. And then that's the third part where NBS can play a role. And the fourth part, in fact, NBS can play a more direct role to coordinate with the CBD as well as the climate change. And in fact, we can say New Go Plus seafood, agricultural development, and the restoration of environment and the poverty alleviation, etc. So in fact, we hope that comprehensive integration can be achieved. In the northwest of China, MBS approach can be used. And now the cost of hydrogen energy, in fact, is almost down to the cost level of normal energy. But of course, we need to think about how to build more storage capacity, etc. And then in the regional mangrove of the development, the MBS can also play a role. And that's the fourth area. And the fifth area is about how we can set up a governance system for MBS itself. In fact, this governance system should include several areas. First, information. And MRV was used for the climate change system. Without a good monitoring and evaluation, in fact, we cannot really provide substantial evidence supporting the benefits of MBS. And also it can provide long-term clarification, and then it can it should also have the good standards. And then the green finance, of course, should play a role in. And then a very core issue here is what is the value of nature? And then final area, we hope to have a system with the involvement of the government, of the private sector, of the NGOs, and we hope to see the mainstreaming of MBS in the policy framework. Due to the limit of time, I'm going to stop it here, and I look forward to more panel discussion later.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wong. It's great to hear as you opened up about the interest among citizens and willingness to pay for eco services. And I want to highlight a theme throughout your remarks, which was really this intersection between nature-based services and agricultural production. I think this is a really important point. I think that we've seen even in projects in Canada that we really can define win-wins, that we can find investments in nature that improve resilience and climate mitigation, but also are supportive of farmers, that engage farmers and actually enhance production. So I think that's a really good point. Next, I'd like to turn to Dr. van der Hoestenay. Please, Sophie, your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting us here, because indeed we've been working quite a lot on nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. So we started working on nature-based solutions in around 2010-13, and getting the expert group together to see how we could move forward the nature-based solutions research and innovation agenda in the European Commission. I won't go into the definition that was developed. I would just like to, the link is there. I would just like to highlight some aspects that are really important in the way that we see nature-based solutions. So first of all, the three pillars of environment, social, and economic are essential. The innovation aspect innovation aspect in the Horizon nature-based solutions is also a strong component, and not just technical innovation, but social, governance, regulatory, business, etc. It addresses also multiple challenges, so it takes a very systemic approach, including, of course, very much the support. It must benefit biodiversity, but it's also looking at coastal resilience, climate adaptation, mitigation, health, economic opportunities, etc. So a whole series of multiple benefits and challenges that it addresses. Finally, this has a very strong approach to co-design to co-management processes. So emphasizing stakeholder engagement to really create a community of practitioners. Thank you. So as we've heard by the previous speakers, really nature-based solutions allow us to really address both climate and biodiversity crises, but not only that, disaster risk crisis, etc. So it's present at the global level, but also in many EU policies. So, for example, it's central in the new EU biodiversity strategy, where NBS is clearly stated as being central to moving that agenda forward, but also in the EU urban agenda, for example, and it's now also central in the EU climate adaptation strategy that's being developed. And we have several leveraging instruments that allow to upscale the nature-based solutions, and I will discuss mostly the ones from the research framework program, so Horizon 2020 up to now, and upcoming Horizon Europe. But just to mention that it's also at member state level with the adaptation plans or through the semester programs. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, one of the instruments to upscale nature-based solutions is through the Research and Innovation Program Horizon 2020, where calls since from 2016 to 2020 have over 200 million euro investment in nature-based solutions. We took a focus on urban. As you can see, mostly the first series of projects were mostly on cities. It was a strategic choice to start with urban, but I would like to highlight that the EU research program is not limited to urban. It also goes at the landscape level, looking at hydromet events or climate and biodiversity, through addressing climate and biodiversity through nature-based solutions at landscape level. And again, you can see a whole series of different challenges that are being met from sustainable urbanization to health to sustainable finance, water issues, etc. You see here a link to all of the projects mentioned. You can go directly visit them. Next slide, please. And so we have a few examples here of the nature-based solutions that are being implemented, just so that we're all on the same wavelength, from wetlands to renaturalizing river courses to restoration of wetlands and creating vegetated floodways or swales, green roofs, walls, floodable urban parks, and a whole series of other examples. And I will include a link later where you can visit many of our case studies. Next slide, please. We also have a special initiative with China. So this fits under the flagship initiative of sustainable urbanization. And we had a call for a cooperation on nature-based solutions between Horizon 2020 and China. And you have those two projects there with the links. But quite a lot of our nature-based solutions have strong links with China, including, because sponge cities were mentioned. Well, one of our projects has close links. Manchester with Wuhan is working there. Next slide, please. And we've been, of course, we're launching all of these projects to, as we've heard, the lack of knowledge. We're trying to contribute to building the evidence base. A recent report came out that looked at all or a series of EU-funded projects relevant to nature-based solutions, although not necessarily always coined under the term nature-based solutions, because as was mentioned also before, it's an ecosystems based approach. And you see you have also specific reports to different policies. And some of the outcomes have already been mentioned of what needs to be done further on financing, but we also have some reports on that, on public procurement of nature-based solutions. The governance issue is coming up regularly, in which the projects are addressing, especially through our multi-stakeholder approach that we have. The knowledge base and the effectiveness of nature-based solutions is also being addressed through the projects with a selection of really key indicators, and that will come out very soon and hopefully will be taken up beyond the EU projects. And there is also been highlighted that there's really a need to increase awareness and capacity building. I'm almost finished. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yes, so this is just to say that nature-based solutions will continue in the Green Deal with the ecosystem restoration call, very much also emphasizing the role of nature-based solutions in transition of society, and then in Horizon Europe, already a whole series with a wide variety of topics. Thank you for your attention. I'll add the links in the chat.
Thank you, Dr. van der Hoostenay. That's just great to hear. One gets the sense of a terrific amount of effort happening in Europe and in many ways kind of leading the way. It's great to hear about those resources. I didn't know about those publications myself, so I'll be looking for those. I'll also say, though, I think it shows the potential for more, because when you look at the Green Deal, when you look at the pandemic recovery plan from the EU, you see nature and nature-based solutions mentioned, but still I think as a relatively small component in terms of the dollars invested relative to some of the other pandemic recovery initiatives. And so I think it also shows the potential for more here, even in Europe. We're getting all kinds of great questions on the Q&A, which I want to jump in, and I'm going to try to summarize a few. But first, let's turn to our final panelist, Ms. Akanksha Khatri. Akanksha, over to you to bring the perspective from the WEF and business and that financing gap. Thank you.
Really pleased to be here. I head the Nature Action Agenda at the World Economic Forum, and a lot of the work that we have done is on putting forward the business and economic case for safeguarding nature. So today, sitting here and looking back on 19th of January 2020, we released a report entitled Nature Risk Rising. And that report identified that more than half the world's GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature. And it's interesting that we are gathered here today exactly 1 year later, and I would argue that the current context and the disruption caused by COVID has left this question moot. The UK Treasury in the last year has commissioned an independent review on the economics of biodiversity led by Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta. And the key message of that independent review has been that we have an asset management problem. Our current economic model values and accounts for capital that is human-made, and therefore we look at physical, financial, and human capital. And yet the biosphere within which our economy and society operate is not accounted for. Over the past decades, while our physical, financial, and human capital has risen steadily, our natural capital has had a shocking decline. And therefore today, our assets portfolio is significantly lopsided. And this is not the case only for industries and economies dependent on sourcing commodities from nature. But the report Nature Risk Rising argues that every business has a dependency and impact on nature. So even if we take an example of an IT or technology company, at the end of the day has a significant amount of dependency on rare earth minerals, which go into both the servers and the computers, but also have a massive impact on nature. So nature loss, what we argue, is a fat tail risk like the 2008 asset price bubble. It cannot be seen with a linear worldview because once triggered, it can have far greater than average implications. Today, if we look at our planetary state, we are reaching, or in some cases have even crossed, the tipping points in very significant areas. And therefore, many of our key biomes, such as the boreal forest, the Amazon, or coral reefs, are under significant threat. So the year 2021 is super critical as it will put to test our frameworks of international governance. And therefore, this conversation comes at a very right time to question ourselves that are we setting ourselves up for success and the world that we want to see in 2030 and 2050 and 2060. So while countries and companies are making commitments, and I think China has done a brilliant job in terms of raising that ambition by committing to going carbon neutral by 2060 and ensuring that there is a strong nature-based solutions component to it, we need to make sure that our actions today are setting us on that path. In the second half of this year, we'll also see the high-level COP meetings of the 3 conventions. So this would be the high-level COP meetings of Convention on Climate Change, Biodiversity, and Desertification. And it's also quite interesting that these will happen just months before they celebrate their 30-year anniversary, because it was in 1992 these Rio Conventions were signed. So it is really questioning us whether we as a humanity and as a world have set the right components and structures and frameworks for governance of our global commons. And businesses can and must be a part of this solution if we have to meet our goals of achieving a carbon neutral and nature positive world. And therefore, as part of the New Nature Economy report series, the second report that we released in July of 2020 was called The Future of Nature and Business. The report identified that if we move towards a nature positive pathway, we can unlock $10.1 trillion of business opportunities and 395 million jobs. And this is super critical because often sustainability can be seen as an expenditure or a cost in any budget. But what the report is arguing, salient as well as shockproof. The report identified 3 socioeconomic systems that had the highest impact on nature loss and therefore also have the most to gain if they shift away from business as usual. And these include food, land, and ocean use, infrastructure and the built environment, and extractives and energy. And we are starting to see businesses really step up to have a change in terms of how we share and spare nature. For instance, Walmart in September of last year during the UN General Assembly week announced that it is taking a step forward in becoming a regenerative company. Similarly, Danone and Unilever have been pushing the agenda of regenerative agriculture under the context of One Planet Lab for Business and Biodiversity. And this is only in the food, land, and ocean use space, which frankly today is causing a huge impact on greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the loss of our topsoil, and with that, the food security that we all desire. But I think previously the speakers also spoke about urbanization and how do we make sure that we are moving towards more nature positive cities or cities that are anchored in biodiversity. Next week at the Davos Agenda Week of the World Economic Forum, the forum will be launching an initiative called the Biodiverse Cities to think about how do we by 2030 actually start living in a city which is surrounded by nature and not just a concrete jungle. And the last piece that I would like to mention, and on the topic of nature-based solutions, is we need to also be able to question that nature-based solutions for what? So yes, carbon sequestration, absolutely, but then how are we also unlocking finance and new sources of income for achieving nature-based solutions for resilience, livelihoods, infrastructure, and so much more? I think Ambassador Patricia Fuller in her remarks earlier talked about this work led by Mark Carney and IIFF, which looks at natural capital assets and is incentivizing the custodians of land to conserve and protect for the long term, while ensuring there is a revenue stream to sustain in the short term. So let's come together and see that we are really creating a world that we want in 2030 by unlocking finance, by triggering innovation, and making sure that we are looking at a public-private collaboration pathway. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ms. Khatri. It's remarkable, those numbers you started with, you know, half of world GDP depending on nature. Of course, we can't reduce nature just to those numbers, but what your analysis shows and what we're saying is the value of nature and the value of nature-based solutions is just so compelling. So thank you for sharing that. I also wanted to add, you mentioned that Walmart announcement in September, and I remember the CEO of Danone opened his remarks at that event by saying, let's be clear, the world's food system will not survive climate change, our current food system. So this is an existential issue for business, and this issue of measurement and valuing is really important, and Scott spoke to that as well. I now want to turn to some questions. We have a few questions to our panelists. I want to just first start, and I'm going to try to summarize some from the chat, but first I want to just start with Mr. Wong. Mr. Wong, I think the world was very encouraged with China's pledge to go carbon neutral by 2060. Can you share with us some thoughts on how you think nature-based solutions might fit into that goal, and how what role they might play, and how China can promote the uptake of nature-based solutions?
谢谢这个问题。
Thank you for the question. This is a very important question. So my first message is that regarding the carbon neutrality, this is a systematic effort, and in China, the most important thing is to really achieve transformation of the economies. So industry, energy, transport, and also trade need to be transformed. So we need to have a full transformation. And the core issue is how to phase out and phase down coal in China. And second, the MBS can play a certain role, but I think the role is still limited if we look at it from now, because we have 11 billion tons, and the carbon sequestration is 1.1 billion roughly. So MBS actually plays a complementary role, but I think in the future, as China really phase down the coal and get away from coal, then the role of MPS will be growing in the future. So there is a trend forward that it will have a growing role. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mr. Wong. So thank you for that. And actually ties very well with Ms. Khatri's comments, because as you said, the big challenge for China, as many of us, is that transition of industries, as you said. And so it's going to make it all that important that we figure out the accounting of this, right? That we create the proper valuation of nature to get that transformation correct. Just some other questions, and I'll open it up to any of our three panelists who'd like to tackle this. You know, MBS is still unknown to many decision makers. So it's a concept used by experts like us. What else can we do? Sophia, you spoke to this a little bit, but what else can we do? What have you found, Ms. Khatri, in your work that can really help us address these systemic barriers for large-scale adoption use to get the message out? Any thoughts?
So I would fully agree that even today it's like such a niche topic, but it's, I guess, also a niche topic because we have designed it as such, and this is how we communicate about it. I think till the time we are unable to connect NBS to issues of livelihoods, jobs, as well as connection with people on the ground, it will be extremely difficult. And I think earlier, Richard, you were also talking about the food systems, and I think that's a fantastic example. I think I come from India, so I would argue, say, in the last 60 or 70 years, we have been pushing a certain model of agriculture to all our farmers, right? We have not been incentivizing nature-based solutions, regenerative agriculture, or permaculture. So these are really NBS which support both the farmer in terms of lower input, as well as it supports the soil for a longer durability. So we need to be able to anchor NBS beyond just a carbon sequestration thing to also connecting it with livelihood, soil health, food security, etc. And then I could imagine there is a point about incentives that need to be tackled as well.
Great point. Thanks. Great points. Thank you. Sophia, anything you'd add to that?
Yes, thank you. I think it's a niche also in the sense that it's a term that actually it's a relatively new term, but it's groups and initiatives that have been going on for quite some time. And for example, if we talk about some traditional agroecology, that's also has multiple benefits. It's just now really concentrating. I think it's really important, and that's what we emphasize in the program, to measure all of these co-benefits so that we can make more aware and interested in the concept. Because if you can show how not only with introducing, for example, nature-based solutions in cities, you're addressing the heat island effect, also addressing health. You're also addressing social cohesion. All of these things will make it will make the concept more attractive to a much wider audience, and we're emphasizing very much that multi-benefit and measuring so that we can prove really the effectiveness of nature-based solutions.
Thanks, Dr. Van der Woestenay. Your comments remind me, Alok, for you and I at the Jeff and IISD, we're hearing so much about this measurement and valuation issue. Measurement, Dr. Van der Woestenay spoke about co-benefits, and Akanksha spoke about that as well. This measurement idea is really central, I think, for getting the full breadth of the co-benefits of nature-based solutions. I want to group a bunch of audience questions kind of together that our panelists might want to talk about. And that is, what are the major financial and economic attractiveness? What are the major issues that provide the major financial and economic attractiveness in MBS? How could we encourage government buy-in, especially given the challenges posed by the pandemic? And what is the role of multilateral development banks? Is there any, I know I'm throwing a lot in there, but I wonder if that stimulates any thoughts from any of our three panelists. Would anyone like to jump in there? Mr. Wong, is there anything you'd like to add to that, or Akanksha or Sophia?
好，谢谢。我想可能这个
Thank you. I think for MBS, well, perhaps we don't need to really have a very clear-cut concept or definition. For example, from 2008, the World Bank doesn't really focus on a very clear-cut definition or concept. They more focus on the practices. I think we should really focus on the practices and the implementation. And then there's a lot of bottom-up work, for example, case studies and modeling and sharing. So, how can we combine this top-down approach with the bottom-up approach? And this is something that I think, China can do some work. And the third is that for developed countries, it might be easier for them to adopt this, but for developing countries, they might be, facing difficulties in implementing the MBS. So, for example, these difficulties might be systematic. It's not just one aspect. For example, their capacity in the development, their technology level, and the use of the big data, all these might be barriers. And only when you have all the conditions in these regards, can you have a very wide adoption of MBS. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wong. Two themes again in there. One is about the measurement, but again, when you talked about implementation bottom up, the importance of case studies and actual examples of where this has happened. Akanksha, it sounded like you might wanted to add something to any of these questions.
Thank you. I think maybe I'll just complement what Mr. Wangi had said. I think two examples that come to mind for me in terms of unlocking finance is this idea of debt for nature swaps, which is really picking up. So I know that Seychelles has definitely looked at it in terms of just being able to work with multilateral development banks and recognizing its marine natural capital assets. And the second one is Pakistan. I think during pandemic, Pakistan really invested a huge amount of resources into providing livelihoods and employment to people in terms of tree planting, and is now also working with IFC to look at how can it capitalize on its natural capital instead of always. So there are new structures which are required, and debt for nature swap seems to be picking up in terms of interest from many countries. So I think those would be the two. And then the other point that I would love to raise is what I think previous speakers had talked about is safeguards. So European Investment Bank, if I'm not mistaken, last year committed to going completely carbon neutral. I think we need similar safeguards for other indicators of nature as well.
Thank you so much, Akanksha. So I'd like to turn, and thank you. I know we're running a little bit over time, but it's I thought it's really important to take some of those audience questions. I want to turn now for just some closing commentary, maybe a minute or two from a couple of CCICED members. First, I'll turn to Mr. Chengchen Zhou, who's the Director of Ecological Protection and Restoration Research Center of the Nanjing Institute of Environmental Sciences of the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. I wonder if you might make a few closing comments.
非常高兴啊，参加这次会议并和大家认识。
It's my pleasure to attend this meeting. I am from the Nanjing Institute of Environmental Sciences under the Ministry of Ecology and Environment in China. I myself have been engaged in the research of eco red line for 7 or 8 years. I have learned a lot from the past few speakers, and I really agree with your opinions on this sector or issue. In fact, here about the eco red line, this issue that I have been familiar with for the past 7 years. Let me share with you the progress China has made. And a lot of the MBS cases have been shared with us just now. And some expert may also say that, in fact, such MBS cases may be local cases or urban cases of small scale. For China, the eco red line, in fact, is quite a systemic and quite all-inclusive effort. And it does cover a very large spatial landscape. In fact, it started from 2017 with the provinces working as the fundamental units of the implementation. And we have had 2 rounds of identification of important priority zones. And in fact, the national land planning, in fact, recently has determined that we have 3 types of a national land: urban land, agricultural land, as well as ecological land. And we know that in the ecological land planning, we definitely need to introduce the MBS approaches to protect such land, which can be very wide-ranging. But of course, eco red line identification or delineation is not that easy to do. In reality, in fact, there are a lot of key challenges needing to be addressed. The balance between the eco red line and economic development, for example, is a very big trade-off. And because if we say some area is a inhibited area for development, then that means economic development will be very difficult in that area to achieve. And then in the future, so we need to think about how to achieve this trade-off between economic development and the ecological conservation. For the same plot of land, are we going to preserve its ecosystem, or are we going to develop it for economic benefits? We need to listen to the opinions from multiple stakeholders. And about the eco red line, I think it definitely has generated benefits in the field of responding to climate change, as well as the adaptation and the conservation of biodiversity. The eco red line, in fact, can yield several benefits as follows. First, spatially, it can help us achieve a greater level of security of eco system, because we will have so-called the eco fragile area and biodiversity conservation area, as well as the so-called economic function area. So the development and identification of those areas, in fact, will help serve the purpose of conserving the natural species. And secondly, in fact, we can also develop the eco products. According to our preliminary accounting, the eco red line, in fact, covers all the nature reserves in China. And the nature reserves, such nature reserves cover 18% of China's land territory, including some major river basins, and over 90% of the natural ecosystems, and national level wildlife preservation parks will be covered. And so eco red line, in fact, will be very important to preserve the ecosystems of China. And thirdly, the eco red line initiative also provides the Chinese experience or Chinese practices for the rest of the world. The Eco Red Line initiative of China is kind of different than the practices from the rest of the world, because this initiative covers a very large scope and very rich contents. Eco Red Line has been listed as one of the MBS initiatives by the United Nations Climate Summit. For the future, I believe the MBS will play an even more important role in our effort to respond to climate change, because we know that this eco red line, in fact, covers 90% of the Chinese natural ecosystems. So it definitely can be a big boost for our preservation. And MBS can also help us restore the ecosystems in a natural way or in a so-called man-made modified way. And such efforts can also help us sequester carbon. So much for my very general introduction of the Chinese Eco Red Line initiative. And in fact, in the 5th plenary session of the 19th Chinese Communist Party Congress, which was concluded last year, not long ago. In fact, this 5th plenary session once again reiterated the importance of Eco Red Line and climate change. So particularly listed some specific tasks. And by 2035, according to the plenary session's declaration, we are going to green up our production means, and we will achieve a stable level of carbon after the carbon peaking. And in fact, for the eco-fragile area, we are going to increase our monitoring effort and also provide greater support to those areas affected by the climate change. And such a declaration, in fact, has already laid out the specific tasks for China's future up to 2035. The ecosystem preservation or conservation definitely will see more actions to take place in China in the future. So much for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chengchen Zhou. So, I think you've hit on a central thread here, which is the considerations of both the economy and the environment. And as Akanksha, her summary work has shown, I think our challenge here with the evolution of nature-based services is to show how those two really we can reject some of the compromise between the two, and that good nature can be good for business. To close us off, could I invite Bernice? And I'm sorry, we're very short on time, but Bernice, I wonder if you could still provide some closing comments. Bernice Lee is Exec Director of the Hoffman Center on Sustainable Resource Economy at Chatham House and a special advisor to CICID. Bernice, do you have some closing comments just to close this session out?
Well, thank you very much, Richard. And also it's a particular pleasure to follow on from obviously Dr. Zhou, who I actually am really pleased that has spent some time laying out the ecological redlining initiative, because I think it's a very important potential contribution from China to the rest of the world when it comes to land use planning and thinking. But also a particular pleasure to follow on from Akanksha, is my former colleague at the WEF, but also Professor Wang Yi, who is a brother in arms, let's just say, on many of the climate related issues. So what I would like to do today is to spend a couple of minutes very quickly outlining some of the sort of high level thinking around what could be a good next step agenda from the perspective as a special advisor, among others. That first of all, of course, it is great to see refreshed momentum around nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions. But what we must make sure, as many have emphasized, is that this is not just a flavor of the month, but that it actually takes roots and is anchored in much longer term land use, economic and ecological planning and implementation. So while it is great to see the proliferation of ideas, initiatives, targets and aspirations, to make sure that it is grounded in the reality of specific place-based implementation, it would also mean that any targets and aspirations have to be connected to long-term financing mechanisms and systems that will make it work and deliver all the associated public goods that have been mentioned by all the speakers, whether it's mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity conservation, food security, livelihoods, or jobs considerations. It also means that it must protect and incentivize the protection of intact long-standing forests and biodiversity that will, as we discussed earlier, support the protection of the longer-term functioning of the bio-based economy and the regenerative agriculture as well. Of course, the danger at the moment is that in some quarters, definitely, natural climate solutions or nature-based solutions are seen as silver bullets or are get-out-of-jail-free card for some large emitters. But we must make sure that we don't waste this emphasis and energy on natural climate solutions or nature-based solutions to make sure that this is just the beginning of a much larger reset around the nature economy. And as Wang Yi also mentioned, natural capital that would actually enable us to realign a post-COVID green recovery package that will actually put much more of the nature and nature-based solutions as the heart of any future undertaking. And because of the importance of these issues, which is why I'm very delighted that Wang Yi particularly was emphasizing the governance systems for NBS, whether it's a question of standards, whether it's about mainstreaming some of the thinking around the MRV ability of some of the nature-based solutions. I think it is very important to emphasize, therefore, as my closing point, that integrity of these commitments and aspirations cannot be overemphasized. And we must explore in future work of CCICED and others, how best to safeguard the integrity of these commitments and initiatives through international, national, and local processes, as well as private sector-based processes, such as supply chain management and etc., that will help us safeguard all the investments today that will actually bear long-term fruit in terms of a reorientation of nature with the global economy in a much more aligned and, let's just say, rightful way than the way that we have done so far. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bernice, and for summing that up so well and for bringing it back to the work of CICED. So I'm going to jump right in because I think we've set the table now for session 2, which is really about exploring different stakeholders' perspectives on what needs to take place to scale up nature-based solutions and how we can continue to build that business case using different tools and policies. So again, I'm just going to introduce our 3 panelists and then we'll jump into their presentations. First, we've got Andrea Bassi, who's a senior associate at IISD with over 15 years of experience working with governments and different international organizations. And he is really experienced on developing models for the assessments of outcomes of policy and investment across a whole range of indicators. So he'll be speaking about how we can best assess the impact and added value of nature-based solutions to ensure predictability of performance. And then we'll have Oliver Schelsky, Natural Assets and ESG Research Lead from Swiss Re, from the Swiss Re Institute. Oliver has been working for Swiss Re for 15 years in different positions and units, and he's currently the Swiss Re Institute's lead on research on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So he'll be speaking about giving a view from the insurance perspective on biodiversity loss and nature-based solutions, which is great because, of course, we know that nature-based solutions improve climate resilience, and of course that is very important for ensuring and mitigating against catastrophic events. And then we have Miss Rachel Terry, the program lead for the theme of accelerating climate initiatives at Van Oord. Rachel is responsible for overseeing the development of existing and new sustainable business for Van Oord in relation to climate adaptation and climate mitigation. She'll be providing a unique private sector perspective on implementing nature-based solutions and talking about the tools that Van Oord has developed and what is needed to further scale up NBS. So that's my very quick introduction. Over to you, Andre, for some introductory remarks on the impact and value add of nature-based solutions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Richard, and I'm very glad to be here and present our experience and the knowledge I have from working in this field and reviewing the literature in the last few years. So what I'm going to say initially sort of summarizes many of the comments that have been made earlier, but also possibly answers many of the questions that are in the Q&A. First of all, when we look at the potential evaluation of projects for nature-based solutions, we need to take, in our experience, a systemic approach. Systemic means that we need to look at social, economic, and environmental outcomes. We need to look at outcomes beyond the project on other economic activities. We need to consider the impact of the projects for different types of stakeholders, private, public sector, businesses, and so on and so forth. And then we need to take into account the outcomes of the project over time, not only during the implementation of the project, but throughout the lifetime of the project or the asset, if you look at a nature-based asset. Now, this requires a variety of tools that have to be used. We cannot use a single approach, a single model, a single data set. We need to perform knowledge integration, which I think is the key word in this case. And it's not so different from what we have been discussing about the Sustainable Development Goals or National Development Planning, or even integrated assessments for specific projects and assets. So in a way, we need to extend the boundaries a bit more, make this systemic approach even more systemic, even more integrated when we look at nature-based solutions. And we need to take into account also that this approach has to include project finance modeling, meaning that we need to have an endpoint that is information that is useful to inform decisions on what to invest and how to invest, especially considering the many benefits that nature-based solutions provide. Now, as a second point, in relation to the many benefits, we need to carry out a customized approach to each nature-based infrastructure project or policy. This is because as soon as we start linking social, economic, and environmental performance in one location, so one context, then these interrelations existing across society, economy, and the environment are unique in a given context. And the climate is unique, economic activities, the way people interact with nature, including culture as well, becomes unique. And that calls for a customization of the models and the approach. Now, that customization, third point, can be performed only if we take a multi-stakeholder approach, meaning that analysts, consultants do not have all the knowledge required, not even if they're local, to capture and understand all the different facets, the different types of relationships existing between social, economic, and environmental indicators and the outcomes of these nature-based solutions and other sectors and economic activities and human activities. So we need to take that co-creation approach based on engaging multi-stakeholder platforms to make sure that we capture all the possible outcomes, positive and negative. We don't want to avoid the negative outcomes, of course. We need to know them ahead of time to better plan and reduce their impacts to make sure that the investment can be a successful one. Then finally, as a fourth point, this is crucial for all investments nowadays, but for nature-based solutions, I would think even more so for a specific reason. We need to take into account climate data and use a variety of scenarios well aligned with climate science to make sure that in the case of nature-based solutions, as I said, the value that they offer can be properly estimated. Mostly because what we see in the literature is that in the vast majority of cases, the value of nature-based solutions increases with extreme events. So they show the potential to increase resilience when there are extreme events related to climate change. Now, on the next slide, if you could transition to the next one, please. We move to the implementation. So what I set up to now is the method. It has to be systemic. It has to include different tools. It has to look at multi-stakeholder approaches and co-creation. But now, what is the result of these assessments? Now, we need to implement that process so that we can create enough of the examples that are required to improve the predictability and knowledge of the performance of nature-based solutions. So on the one hand, as I said, we need to customize the approach, but on the other hand, we need to have a large number of case studies so that we can derive lessons learned and we can find information that can be used across a variety of new investments. Now, this is important because we have to improve the predictability of climate impacts. We need to understand how nature-based solutions respond to these emerging, changing trends over time. And this has to be done not only in relation to nature-based solutions, this has to be done also in relation to other infrastructure assets. So we need to improve the knowledge and as well predictability of performance of nature-based solutions on their own, as well as in relation to other types of infrastructure investments. This is because some of the services, the ecosystem services that we receive from nature-based solutions are directly comparable to the services that built infrastructure provides. And so this is a way of comparing performance that does not have to be reduced only to the economic value, but certainly allows us to figure out what are the pros and cons of different types of investments. Now, what we do in the end with these results is hopefully to increase the confidence that nature-based solutions and nature-based infrastructure not only can compete with built infrastructure, but very often they provide better value for money, not only for the investors, but from a societal point of view. And what you see in the image at the bottom are some features of the analysis we would perform. Based on the biophysical performance of the nature-based solutions, we can derive information on the social outcomes and the economic outcomes. Some of these are tangible, related to cash flows. Some others are intangible, meaning there is no market, they may not be enjoyed and used as services by the population. Nevertheless, we have to highlight them because again, nature-based solutions provide a variety of services, some of which may remain silent, unknown, unnoticed for quite some time. But then when an extreme event strikes, it turns out that it's a very, very important value. And if you lose it over time, then we're really in trouble. Now, on the next slide, my final one, I want to highlight the role of this work in the context of investments, since this has come up quite a few times before. So we want to demonstrate the financial viability of nature-based solutions. Modeling in the end, when it's connected to project financing, is oriented towards that goal. And what we want to do here is highlighting what is the impact of internalizing some of the externalities that are normally not accounted for in conventional cost-benefit analysis or project financing assessment for conventional assets, and what happens when you internalize them in nature-based solution-related projects. Now, when we look at conventional assets, it turns out we reduce the value of the project, we show risk. When we look at nature-based solutions, often introducing these values generates more value addition, makes the projects more financially viable. Now, what we need to look at here is potentially how we manage the potential volume of investment that will come into nature-based solutions. As many people commented before, also in the chat, there is a risk that if this market is flooded with money, then we may not be able to select the right projects. Or on the other hand, we may just go for the projects that generate the highest return, maybe not for those that generate the strongest societal return on the environmental and the social side. So we need to be able to generate the evidence that allows us to assess in a transparent way, in a clear way, how these projects perform in relation to other types of assets. In other words, we need to come up with a step-by-step approach or guide for how to make nature-based solutions become an asset class, but in a way that reflects the unique characteristics of this investment. Now, this, as Alok mentioned before, is exactly the goal of the project we are about to start with the GEF. We want to create enough of the knowledge base to start providing useful inputs to decision makers to assess what returns, societal returns, not only economic, they can get out of investing in nature-based solutions. Again, it's a challenge. We need to integrate knowledge. We need multi-stakeholder processes. We need to use different tools to give justice to the social, economic, and environmental outcomes of these projects. But it's something we're very happy to embark on. And thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak. And I look forward to receiving questions and answering online. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrea. And again, we've heard so much about measurement today. And so it's great to see the work that you are doing together with the GEF. It's fantastic. I'll just offer one comment that we can maybe come back to in the discussion if we have time. And that is, it strikes me that in a world of ultra low interest rates, the case for nature-based solutions is even stronger, the financial case, because the upfront financing costs are lower, but the net the net benefits of the future benefits of nature-based solutions is increased through the lower discount rate. So there's for us finance-oriented folks, a thought. Oliver, discount rates is a big, obviously a central defining metric for the insurance industry. Can you give us a sense for just the insurance industry perspective? We all care about nature, we all care about biodiversity. Why is the insurance industry concerned about biodiversity and nature-based solutions? What perspective can you share with us? Over to you.
Yeah, hi Richard, hi everybody. So many thanks for the invitation, also to your wonderful staff. My first 3 slides, they stand in a way in line with the thinking of the previous speakers. So I will go through them very fast and concentrate on the second half. And as you said, right, for insurance, it's not only the discount rate that matters in regard to investment part, but it's also, like Andrea has pointed out, the modeling of extreme events. And let's go to the third slide, please. Yes. And as the ambassador in the beginning has pointed out, we cannot think biodiversity protection nor ecosystem restoration alone or independent from climate change, mitigation, adaptation, because these are, let's say, 2 sides of the same coins, as we also see here from the human activities that negatively impact the biodiversity loss. And if you invest in biodiversity and ecosystem service restoration, you'll get multiple dividends, even far beyond climate adaptation or climate mitigation. So Swiss Re, of course, we are very scientific. We stand in the tradition of science. The 4th slide, please, gives a spectrum of what is at stake. And if we look at the right-hand side, this is exactly what Akansha from the WEF has pointed out. This is the opportunity side, that nature-based solutions really can generate a lot of value and create a lot of jobs. And the left-hand side, the 510 billion flagship number here, that's the number that the Dutch National Bank with the Dutch Ministry of Environment has found out that if ecosystem services underpinning the economy in the Netherlands wouldn't be working any longer, 510 billion or 36% of the investments of all Dutch financial institutions would be at stake. Considering what is reinsurance, right? Insurance, reinsurance, we are a risk observer. So we provide financial protection against catastrophic events. And that is where, for example, here the second number comes into place, the 272 billion. It says that without functioning coral reefs, flood damages for the strong storms would increase by 91% to the enormous number 272 billion. So therefore, it's clear that the ecosystem services that functioning reefs provides, and there are also mangroves and seagrasses, protects values from the strong impact of storm surges. Maybe we go to the next slide already. Yeah, so what matters, of course, if you are in the financial services industry, either banking or insurance, is that we think communication-wise is important to, let's say, argue in the area of nature contributions to people. To businesses in the manufacturing, pharmaceutical industry, the case is clearer if you point to the value of ecosystem services, which are, you see on the left-hand side, the direct contribution to economic activity, the indirect contribution, and as I have said with the coral example, the protective value. And that leads to the right-hand side that I think also Akansha pointed out, where I think it was Governor Carney who put these kind of risks in alignment exactly. Carney put these risks in alignment to the climate change. And then it was the OECD in 2019 preparing GZ7 who put these risks into a relation to biodiversity decline. And there it comes into place where it matters for insurance. So just 2 examples in light of time. The ecological risk is you are a manufacturer, a car producer, a pharmaceutical. You need a lot of water for your production. So if scarcity involves for whatever reason, then you might have a problem if a tipping point approaches. So you need a strict mechanism to make sure you have your supply in place. And another risk, just to briefly this, mentionly, reputation risk, market risk, we see a shift in supply and demand patterns. We see a shift in public sentiment. So if you are a producer, not in the financial services industry, But in other industries, yeah, you must make sure that you have in place, reduce your dependency, make sure what is a positive or negative impact. Let's go to slide 7 then already. So it's the second half. One more, please. Yes. So yeah, Swiss Re, we have started to build nature-based insurance solutions, mostly out of our public sector solutions arm. And we see this as actions inspired and supported by nature that build resilience and provide social and economic benefits. And they can either reduce exposure, reduce sensitivity, or support the adaptive capacity. So this goes, we have also seen this, I think Sophia, you've pointed it out. It goes from erosion control to management of inland flooding, up to the sustaining natural resources in drier areas with agroforestry measures. And I would devote most time now to the slide 8, 9, and 10. If you go to the next one, please. So now, why insurance, right? The insurance perspective is that if there are investors in nature-based solutions or in any kind of projects, we can insure against project delay or non-completion, because often any kind of infrastructure is tailored to a certain time when it should be ready to get in place. And of course, we can protect the investment, even the returns, against natural hazards. So businesses benefit because the revenue that they earn can be protected, and costs that can be covered while the business interrupted could also be insured. And of course, government were mentioned quite often, that yeah, insurance, reinsurance can also insure governments for the regeneration and associated revenues. And the benefit is here that insurance gives you, let's say, a fast payout to have recovery cost, is in a way an umbrella to have financial means speedily delivered, is no payback obligation in insurance, in contrast to laws, and it can reduce a country's contingent liabilities with positive implications also for sovereign rating. And also insurance can, let's say, limit the pressure to divert own funds from other projects in affected areas. Now I have two case studies. I will devote more time on the first case study, which is the coral reef protection that our public sector team in Mexico did. So here comes the point, right? Extreme events. The Mexico Caribbean coast in 25 was devastated by 2 hurricanes with 8 billion damages and a loan in Quintana Roo. But what found out that few hotels and beaches in Puerto Morelos region, they suffered less. They suffered less, likely resulting from an intact coral reef. So the coral reef there is important because people go snorkeling, there are pretty beaches, and there is a very important hotelier industry that generates local and regional economic benefits. So Swiss Re teamed up with the Nature Conservancy, which in a way found out that 97% of wave energy is estimated to be reduced by healthy coral reef. So it is important if you invest in the reef, if you make sure that the local people, and this was a transformative deal because it was done with the local people, local university, local people were trained to keep the reefs in order. If you protect this, then the impact of the stern surge could be reduced. So at the end, we triggered a parametric deal, and that helped activate. It paid out this year to provide ad hoc money. I skip just show slide number 9 because my following speaker will address this. It's a dike that we protected in regard to contractors' all-risk policy. And let's go to slide 10, and then I'm finished.
Thank you, Oliver.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you. And we went a bit over time, but I didn't want to stop because those case studies are so compelling. And thank you for outlining some of those benefits of nature-based solutions from the insurance perspective. I think it's really important. So could I turn now to Rachel? And I know we're short on time, but Rachel, we're just looking for some insight on private sector solutions from your perspective, Van Oord. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. I will try to keep it a little more succinct than I was planning. I will get through the early slides, and same as for Oliver, I will try to get to the later part of the story because I think that's what's got the most rich content for this discussion. Thank you very much for hosting me, and I think I'm building on, actually I'm very lucky that I'm the last speaker. I build a lot on what everybody else has already said and the need for nature-based solutions and how we're going to implement them. So I would like to just quickly walk you through Van Oord for people to understand what we're trying to achieve as a company and how we're trying to innovate and proactively deliver nature-based solutions in place of perhaps traditional hard engineered infrastructure. So next slide, please. I will go through these first slides very quickly. Yeah, this is just about our core values as a company. We have a purpose as a family-owned company with over 150 years experience to really create a better world for future generations, and nature-based solutions is obviously a natural way for us to really deliver that purpose. Next slide, please. I'm really sifting through very quickly here. This is our sustainability strategy, which also encompasses, of course, how we want to deliver nature-based solutions, not just in certain elements of our sustainability strategy, but actually across the board. It's really important. And I would have liked to go in more detail here, but I think it's not necessarily relevant for this discussion. What I think is important to say here is that, as I say, we have some really key themes that we work on from a sustainability perspective, because that's where we believe as a company we can have the most positive impact. And I would like to focus on two of the themes, which is climate initiatives, where I'm responsible for as the program manager, and nature and communities, which of course threads through all of our sustainability approach. So maybe to the next slide. Yeah, these kind of images, we've all seen them, but they will become more and more common. What's happening with climate change, and I don't think I make any surprising story for anybody, but we're really seeing this extreme weather, sea level rise and global warming. And the reason why I'm telling this, because indeed it's not a surprise for everybody, is that these challenges really require integrated solutions on a landscape scale to protect those societies and ecosystems which are most at risk. And the reason why that's important for Van Oord is because we feel that we have a responsibility to actually use our experience and the knowledge which we've built up over the last 150 years in sort of on the verge of land and water to actually provide proactively, and that's a key word here, climate resilient solutions. But what's really important for me to stress is Van Oord is not going to manage that on their own, despite all our drive. We really need to find the right strong partnerships. We need that political steering, and we need financing to help us get these nature-based solutions through that can protect people and ecosystems. And from my perspective as the program lead for climate initiatives, protecting people and ecosystems that are most impacted by climate change. Next slide, please. Actually, you can skip the next slide. I will jump to the sixth slide because of time. What's really important is I want to say how Van Oord is going to go about doing this. What I'm showing you on the screen now is what we call our climate risk overview. And I was really happy that Patricia mentioned in her introduction about the Climate Adaptation Summit, which is taking place on Monday. And this is really a first for Van Oord as a private company. We've created a global map. It's a tool where we've layered up lots of data related to climate, low-lying land populations, but also ecology. So you see there on the left, corals, mangroves, and we put that together in this tool. And the reason why this is a first for us is because we're not normally developing these kind of things, but not only have we developed it, but we're going to release it publicly. So this will be available to the public, to stakeholders, to politicians, to financing parties, to everybody from Monday. So that was why I was very happy Patricia mentioned the summit on Monday, where we will launch this tool. And I will also put a link in the chat after I've spoken so that people can connect to us and see what we're doing at that event. But what I really want to mention about this tool, and the reason why we find it important to be transparent, is because we all need to find the focus on the right areas where we can have the biggest impact. And as I mentioned already, Van Orde is not going to manage that on their own, and that's why it's important that we make this public so that we can all work together and collaborate to deliver projects for the areas where we need to have that big impact. So next slide, please. I'd like to just share a few examples, and I was really glad Oliver mentioned also a nice dike example from the Netherlands. The Netherlands is renowned for being quite climate resilient and also implementing a number of nature-based solutions. I just show here a few small examples. The picture in the bottom left is a mangrove belt recovery project that we did, and again stressing we did this through a consortium that we work in called EcoShape. It was really important to work with the local population because actually it was the local population who had been destroying the mangroves and allowing the coastline to recede. So we needed to work with them. How could they sustainably work with aquaculture? So they had a socio-economic system in place to maintain themselves, but also to interact with the mangrove belt in a healthy way. So that's why these nature-based solutions, of course, we need financing, we need political steering, but you absolutely need to work with the local stakeholders. And that was the big learning curve for us here, because otherwise you also can't implement them and make them sustain over the whole life cycle. So that's really important. And I think mangroves is a really powerful area to work in when you talk about nature-based solutions and coastal resilience, because basically mangroves not only are helping us to be resilient and adapt to the climate, but they also provide immense climate mitigation because they act as a carbon sink. And that was actually how in the beginning we came in touch with IISD, because we talked about how can we use a carbon crediting solution, for example, with mangroves. Yeah, I would love to tell you more about the solutions I'm showing here on the screen. In the top, you see Honsbosser Petimer Sea Defence in the Netherlands, where we chose to build a sandy solution with seagrass, with grass in the dunes, instead of placing a big hard seawall here, which I think everyone can agree is a more beautiful and actually a better socio-economic solution. And in the bottom right, some insight into the coral rehabilitation work which we do, which Oliver already touched on, is really important for the for protecting coastlines as well. And these kind of solutions are the ones we would like to implement. But yeah, we face the same challenges which have been mentioned by so many of the earlier speakers about creating the right perceptions of nature-based solutions with local communities, about making sure we don't necessarily always, we can start with pilots, but we need to look at things on a landscape scale. And then indeed, exactly as is the point of this part of this webinar, is how do we build the business case? And the business case is not just about financing, but it's also about the social impact, the environmental impact, the political steering. And I'm really happy that Andrea was in this session, and we already are very keen to work with the IISD and Jeff on sort of how do you assess and measure these nature-based solutions so that we can start to really talk about them on a scale. I would actually love to say so much more, but I'm trying to keep it short, Richard. I think the main thing is that I really want to stress that to deliver nature-based solutions, we really need to work together. Everyone needs to collaborate, and we need to deliver those solutions at scale. And everything else put into the chat, Richard.
Rachel, thank you so much. I think having that perspective is so valuable from Van Orde. Thank you for sharing those examples. I'm really excited to look at that link and look through the tool that you'll share today and then also next week at the Adaptation Summit. You know, it's interesting to me also that you touched on corals and mangroves, and Oliver spoke about coral. The connection I'd make is certainly in ISD's work. Some of the solutions that are most attractive and show the best benefits have to do with water, that have to do with managing runoff and things like that. So again, I think one insight I have from today is that when we're looking for those initial projects and ones that people can relate to and understand, it often involves water. There's so many questions here, and I apologize to audience members. I know it's frustrating when you join a call like this that you can't get all your questions answered, and we don't have time to go through them, but I would direct folks to the chat, and I'm just going to summarize a few now. now, and I'll ask panelists maybe to go into the chat and address them. We've seen lots of good questions. People asking, are all projects that call themselves NBS, do they really get accepted as such, or what's the definition? What are some factors to consider to ensure or increase the success of NBS? How can the NBS or nature-based solutions be properly understood as not a simple silver bullet and not misapplied to cover actions that are bad for biodiversity and local communities? And maybe I'll add as a comment here, I think all of us working in this field, we know that nature can't be reduced to numbers, because without nature, the game is over. But the point is that in the world, a lot of financial decisions are made, and if we don't properly account for them and make those decisions involving nature, we're going to make a lot of bad decisions, and that's why the focus on measurement and valuing nature-based solutions. Let me just turn, as we wrap up in these final few minutes, I've got Sagarika Chatterjee, Director of Climate Change from COP26, and a special advisor to CICID. Sagarika, do you have some closing comments you'd like to make on this session? Any observations from our presentations?
Sure, thank you very much, Richard. I'll just check, can you hear me okay?
We can indeed.
Excellent, good. Yes, so I'm fascinated by what I heard. I think what I'd like to add to the discussion so far is a bit of an investor finance perspective, and specifically just thinking about the role of nature-based solutions in creating more sustainable investments by asset managers and asset owners. And for that, we really need two things. One is investors have deforestation-free portfolios, easier said than done, but needed. And the second is investors really examine the nature-based solutions investment opportunities. So thereby the first is on risk, and the second really is more on the kind of the return side. What I wanted to add is the developments we're seeing, and we commissioned some work at PRI that's feeding into a few different things, the vivid economics, is that negative emissions technologies are really the next investment frontier. So corporate demand for forest-related carbon removal could generate $800 billion in annual revenues by 2050. What's relevant is that this could see assets of over $1.2 trillion, surpassing the current market cap of oil and gas, the oil and gas industry. So we could see an entire industry really starting to emerge. And so, for example, in the last year, we've seen a threefold increase in corporate net zero commitments from 500 in 2019 to over 1,500 in 2020. And what's been interesting is some of the highest emitting sectors that have been worst hit by the pandemic have this net zero ambition, including oil and gas, steel, cement, automobiles, and food. And so companies are going to need to turn to carbon removal and to nature-based solutions, which is going to drive demand. So the emerging financing mechanisms we're seeing are around distressed assets, around stewardship model, where leaseholders are involved in more of the restoration, sustainable farming agreements, and then green bonds. But what we think is really needed is that both investors and companies invest in nature-based solutions and ensure there is no deforestation at the same time. The twin goal needs to be covered. And we need to see support, including from the finance community, and really engaging for development of a sustainable nature-based solutions market, where this market's developed, it's commercialized, and we need a global standard for nature-based solutions projects and more safeguards. Through the CCICED work, we're delighted an international team is working with a Chinese team on an SPS on green finance. And in that, what we're examining a bit further is the idea of nature positive principles that financial institutions could adopt, whereby there is no net loss in investments or in financing, and also looking at agricultural subsidy reform and debt and biodiversity, as I think one of the previous speakers mentioned. So just like to highlight overall, this is an emerging area, an investment frontier, but many safeguards needed, and that twin track approach of end deforestation while building up a new market.
Thank you, Ms. Chatterjee. You make a really compelling argument that, you know, the transition to net zero is accelerating, and we've seen a remarkable uptake by companies. And you make a really compelling argument that the demand, therefore, for nature-based solutions will increase, and that's going to increase the need for these tools and these analyses and the very discussion we're having today. So thank you for those remarks. Scott, I wonder now if we could just turn for closing remarks. I know we're a few minutes over, but I still really want to hear at the end, hear from Scott Vaughan, our International Chief Advisor to CCICED. Scott, some summary remarks and thoughts on today's session?
But just to say, I mean, this has really been brilliant. So really sincere thanks to all the presentations. Lots of really great to see so many friends and colleagues from different CCICED special policy studies. I just want to make three very less than 1 minute, Richard. Three quick comments. I mean, the first one, colleague talked about fat tail risk. This has generally been associated with climate change and less with biodiversity. But I think this year, particularly with COVID-19, underscores the growing and nonlinear threat of ecosystem destruction. The IPBES and other reports underscore the need for urgency. And nature-based solutions is being one of many tools to be able to address this global crisis. I mean, I think the second, almost all talked about the importance of integrated or systemic approaches to nature-based solutions. There's lots of different really interesting platforms, and this the landscape approach to this, I think is immensely promising, or China's ecological red line we heard about. One for those that are looking at a tool called Nature Map, which is looking at a convergence of areas of high carbon or climate interest, high ecological interest, as well as an overlay with the Sustainable Development Goals. The third is in our work in CCICED, building on the IUCN principles. The first is just protect what you have in all countries. Just to look at what's there. If they're not in formalized protected areas, set them up in protected areas, both from an ecological perspective, but also because of their carbon role. Restoration or afforestation are promising, but the time lag for many of these ecosystems, mangroves, coral reefs, wetlands, and others, are often decades or multiple decades. So looking at returns now and the urgency is protect first. And the final comment I'd make is just in addition to this sort of busy year we have with COP26 in Glasgow and COP15 in China, we're looking at the Global Food Summit. It's going to be held in September in New York. And it underlines Sigerica's last point of looking at zero deforestation within complex supply chains, of which food systems and soft commodities are an incredibly important driver of ecological destruction. So there's work in China Council in this, as well as Debt for Nature Swaps and others. And so we really look forward to working with so many colleagues on this call. Again, Richard, thanks for your brilliant sharing. And also, again, wanted to thank IISD colleagues of Annika Turton and Anne Hamill and others for their really great work in putting this together. So thanks very much.
What great points, Scott. You know, thank you. Yeah, we've all been thinking, those of us who are concerned about climate have been thinking about nature-based solutions relative to adaptation and mitigation. But to absolutely point out, especially in this year of COVID, the link to biodiversity, the integrated approaches, we know that the benefits of nature-based solutions are really diverse, right? And so our approach to them has to be equally so. And the point on food, again, I would, you know, from my experience of looking at nature-based solutions, especially in Canada, we've got to push ourselves for the win-wins with agriculture. There are ways to do this and projects that farmers embrace and support. And those are the solutions we need to look at. Thank you all. I want to close by thanking everyone for attending this event. A special thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their expertise expertise. The event has been recorded and will be available on the IISD website shortly. And if you're interested to learn more, as we mentioned out at the start, Ambassador Fuller mentioned it, look out for more nature-based solutions events next week at the Climate Adaptation Summit, which you can find at cas2021.com, which is January 25th, 26th next week. Thank you all again. I wish you a very good day. Bye now.